Islands are made up of relatively small communities. From your experience, how do the socio-cultural environments in the Pacific influence our concept of privacy? Do we see it differently from other countries? If you could share your experience. The fourth question is, given the way we view what is private or public, what kind of considerations do we need to have when we develop guidelines for online privacy? And how can global institutions and internet companies can better accommodate our needs? The fifth question is, there are many tools that we as users can use to protect our privacy, adjusting security settings, having virus protection, controlling cookies, using encryption, blocking pop-ups, installing firewalls, etc., etc. But the average user often has no training or not enough understanding on how to do this. What resources do we have or do we need? What kind of avenues can we take? Which organizations, institutions can we tap into to help us spread awareness? What is the role of the local internet and content service providers or operators in this? For the ordinary internet user, what about for small businesses? Sixth question, are there existing policies, local or regional, that may be applicable to online privacy or that can incorporate a privacy protection aspect? A, what kind of mechanisms do or can we have to address violations to online privacy, data breach incidents, etc.? Second is, as the internet is global, several policy bodies accuse that we also need a more unified approach to privacy. Can we have a pan-Pacific framework for online privacy? The last question is, what is your wish list for a good online privacy framework? What are the issues that we need to address? And who needs to get involved? What factors do we need to look out for? Okay, thank you very much. As speakers, let's begin with Gerard Metsan, the CIO. Thank you, Gerard.
Thank you, Doreen. First, I forgot all your questions. Anyway, thank you very much for the questions and the opportunity for me to speak at this very interesting topic, which is the online privacy. I think this is a topic that is very much on, as we say in French, actualité. That means current. It's a real issue that is affecting everybody. Last year, we had a meeting, numerous meetings in my office with consumers of banks coming into my office and complaining because they lost millions and millions of Wado in their accounts because people have accessed their accounts and robbed the money. So this is a clear picture of online privacy. How do those guys manage to get into those accounts in the bank through ICT? I also received a lot of complaints from parents that comes to my office for students that have access to porn materials through ICT. This is online privacy. How do we make sure that we prevent published items that you think that is only private for you, not intended for public, but you find out that it's been hacked and then published on the internet? This is a real issue that we need to address. I think many reasons we can talk about that are most common. But one of the most common reasons is the habit and the users, how they use internet. Because when you see your friend that is publishing everything on the internet, you say, oh, I want to do this also. Because he's doing this and I'm doing this, I'm doing it also. Firstly, when you use the ICT, there are many possibilities on how we can fix this thing, but for the government, Doreen, I think first we need a clear policy from our side. and that policy will be stipulated in a framework that we call the cyber security legislation, which is still under review. And under this legislation, you will have all the required measures that the country will need to implement in order to counter those cyberspace activity. When I mentioned the online banking today, the issue with the online banking, we know the people that have committed this, but we cannot prosecute them. The issue is because the current laws in Vanuatu does not allow us to do it. So the people can do this freely in Vanuatu. So this is a real issue for us at the moment. So we need to make sure that this bill must be passed in order to prosecute those guys. Small communities, so the role of the communities. I think it's important for the society to be first aware about the risk, because when you are not aware of the risk, then you can do whatever you want to do without knowing that the action that I'm doing is risky. So I think one of the best way to know this is to be. We have one office in Vanuatu, which we call TRR, and those people in there, they are responsible of what we call consumer awareness. And in the consumer awareness, they have some programs that talks about all those issues also, on how you behave when you use internet. You don't just disclose your bank account. You don't just disclose your personal details on the internet without knowing that it's risky. The other measures that we need to implement also, there are some technical measures that we need to do in the operator side. And these are, for example, we need to secure the domain names. And I don't know if this, I don't think this has been done widely in Vanuatu. That means when you look for a domain name, people can replicate your bank account screen, and then point it to another server. And then you don't actually, because you only look at the screen, you don't know that this thing, when you type your information in, you press send, it's not going to be sent to your bank. It's sending it to another person. So that person gets your bank detail and so on. To avoid this to happen, we need the operators to make sure that all the DNS customers, they apply for what they call DNSSEC. This is something that needs to be done, and it's a crucial thing. And the other thing also for the banks is to apply what we call the two-way authentication, which is still not yet done in Vanuatu, and this is really important to be done. Those are all technical things, some of the measures that comes in on top of my head at the moment, and we really need to make sure that this is done. The other way that how the community can participate is to advocate and to communicate the risk. To make sure that the young people, because our country is composed with, I think, more and more people of 25 years old and plus. So this young generation, they tend to be using more and more the ICT softwares, like applications like Facebook and YouTube and all those applications. And if we don't contribute in educating them on how to best use the internet, then we for sure end up in having these issues. I think in terms of the regional applicable to online privacy, I will, at the moment, the Vanuatu government, we don't have any regional agreement yet, but we have started something with PIRC. But we need to, I don't want to speak about this at the moment. Maybe my colleague, Lipton, will evaluate more on this. And the privacy, the policy, as I told you already, we have what we call the cyber security legislation that needs to be passed. And we are aiming for, before end of this year, to have this legislation passed. And then also we have this online child protection bill that needs to be addressed also. And I'm wondering when this can be passed, because it's not under our responsibility, it's within the Ministry of Justice. So we can have more information on this and later on if you are still interested. I will still, but those are the main policy guidelines that need and legislations that needs to be passed in order to put some framework and put some ways on how we can combat those problems of online privacy. Thank you, Doreen.
Okay, thank you very much, Gerard. As you've heard from the government level, we only have the policy, the cybersecurity policy in place, the legislation which is still in draft, and then the online child protection legislation which is still underway. But in the meantime, Diarara has been playing a big role to advocate for the behavior, how to use internet, and privacy for the users. Thank you very much, Gerard. We move on to the next speaker, which is Dan Macari.
Thank you, Laura. You've everyone. We said I come today. I'll speak in English, but if anybody has questions afterwards in Bishlama, Francais, any language, I'm sure most of us can answer in just about any language. When you work in the media, information is our product. It's what we do, and we have two sides to the thing. The media, obviously, we want as much information as is reasonably possible to be available to everybody. That's why you give us money. I mean, that's why you pay the 100 Vatu for the newspaper every day, is because we tell you things that you didn't know yet that are important. Things about what's happening in the government, things about what's happening in our society, things that are happening with the economy, with our culture, with all aspects of life in Vanuatu. That's basically how we make our living every day, is by dealing in information. When we talk about information, though, there are limits to what we can share and what is what we call in the public interest. And those limits they come about from a number of reasons. One of the main reasons is protecting the identities of people who share information with us. In some cases, we will have situations where people will blow the whistle. They'll send us information about things that are happening that the public needs to know about. Sometimes these are bad things, sometimes these are good things. In the most common cases are related to public corruption. We saw a number of cases. I mean, the whole bribery trial that ended up seeing 14 members of parliament convicted of public corruption started with a story in the Vanuatu Daily Post, and it was a photograph of a stack of money sitting on the speaker's desk. And so when somebody comes to us with information, we need to assure them that they are not going to suffer for having shared that information with us. So protecting sources, protecting people's identities, and protecting the privacy of the individual in the space, in the public space, is something that we take very, very seriously. One of the most common examples of this is when we have cases of domestic violence, of sexual abuse, of crimes in which the victim has often already suffered a lot, and who can sometimes be made to suffer more when the news of their abuse comes out. And so protecting the identities of the victims of crime is something that we care about a great deal. It's one of the abiding issues, right up there with protecting our sources. The last aspect of it, though, on online privacy, and this is something that matters a lot as well, is the right of people to not to be silenced, to be able to share their opinion, to be able to share their views, even when they're stupid, they're wrong, and they're offensive, and they are, just wrong in every way. That's something that's very difficult to balance with the other aspects of privacy. The issue of Olgyaman name, fake names, in Facebook. This is something that everybody comes around. You know, I'm not going to believe you. I'm just not going to listen to you if you don't show me who you are. But what if I have to hide my identity? What if that's the only way that I can tell you something? And if I'm wrong, I mean, if the point that I'm making is correct, if the point that I'm making is valuable, then who cares what my name is? I mean, one of the things that struck me when I've lived in small communities all my life, but when I came to Vanuatu, one of the things that struck me was the very first thing, whenever I repeated something that somebody had said, the response to me would be, "Hui talam." Who said that? It's not what did they say, but who said that. That's equally important. And this is something that we need to reconcile ourselves with, because it is something that's unique to small communities, to island communities. And yet, it's something that we need to adjust. Because the fact of the matter is that who said the thing isn't nearly as important in the public sphere as what was said, as what the idea was. The fact that, you know, Doreen has a good idea and I don't like it doesn't matter. You know, whether she's a woman, she's from the VNPF, I'm a man, I'm in the media. If she has a good idea, then it's a good idea. And if I had the idea, then I had a good idea. But it doesn't matter who had the idea, as long as we can all recognize that it's a good one. And this is the thing that we need to get past a little bit, because in the past we have deferred to other people's opinions, sometimes at our own expense. And so when we talk about privacy, we need to protect the right of people to have ideas as well. In other words, we need sometimes to ourselves willfully step back from drawing the person's identity into the public sphere, to leave their identity in the private sphere, and to bring their ideas and their pronouncements and their opinions, bring those into the public sphere without implicating the individual. Now, that's not something we can do with legislation. That's something that we do because we agree that it's the right thing to do. And there's a long tradition of that in the geek community, in the IT community elsewhere. There used to be an old joke that said, on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog. And it's basically saying, you know, you can be whoever you want on the internet. Now, that's changed quite a bit in recent years, but the fundamental principle of focusing on ideas over identities is very, very important. What are the challenges that we face when we protect all of these things? First of all, as Gerard rightly said, technological just understanding of what technology is, how it works, and how to protect ourselves is something that's very important. I'm going to say a word to you right now, and I want you, every single one of you, to pay very close attention. The word is Signal, and it's the name of an application, S-I-G-N-A-L. You go to the Google Play Store, install it on your phone. It encrypts every single text message you send to somebody else who's using Signal. So if you and your friend are using this application, it's free of charge. You can send a text message to them, and it's encrypted all the way, so nobody can see what you're texting. I'm going to say another word to you. That's Facebook Chat. If you're chatting with somebody on Facebook, it's encrypted end to end. That means that the things that you say on chat are, you can trust them to the degree that you can trust the person or the people that you're chatting with. So if you don't trust that person not to take a screenshot and share that around, then don't say anything. But there are those are two very simple, easy to use tools that you can use to protect yourself from the kind of situation that Gerard was describing, which is, you know, when somebody sends a photograph, when somebody shares a message that they think is an intimate message, and suddenly it becomes private, or it becomes public, I should say. That's part of it, is just learning the tools that you can use. The other part of it is to do with policies, and not so much with these are not necessarily legislated policies, though RTI and things like that do come into it. But the way in which we conduct our conversations, our public conversations and our private conversations, we need to remember how things worked in the village. You know, if when something's happening inside the house, or some next door to us in the village, if it's inside the house, it's inside the house. It's, you know, it's like an imaginary wall has gone up, and it's not our business. And when, you know, if somebody slips and they, you know, they make a rude noise or something, you know, like, I'm going to use a silly example. We don't, you know, crow all over town. We don't go all over the place if somebody farts in the next room, because that's their private space and we respect their dignity, and we don't do that. And yet, we do that, exactly that kind of behavior, just childish, jealous, petty, vindictive behavior against people on Facebook. And it's because people don't realize that they're making noise in a public space. But just because people are ignorant and innocent in this sphere doesn't mean that we should be taking advantage of that. So that's a social thing that we just have to learn ourselves. And the next element that we need to bring into the conversation, so we've got the technical tools, we've got the social tools, and then we need the formal tools. Now, I've always been a very, very strong believer that the things that you know, the laws that govern us in the real world, in the, you know, in the world of objects, should be the same laws that govern us in the digital world. And Gerard and I have had some lively discussions around the cybercrime bill that's being proposed. My personal feeling, and it's one that I've held for a very long time, and I hold it professionally as well, is that libel is libel is libel. In other words, no matter where if you say something that is defamatory, that is malicious and is designed to destroy somebody's reputation in the public sphere, then you can be and you should be punished for doing that. There's no question about that. Now, the fact that you've done it over a computer is no different to the fact, you know, to if you've done it in the pages of our newspaper. I hope that never happens. Or if you say it in a public meeting, or if you say it in, you know, just in a bar or a nakamal or something, or on the street. If you denigrate somebody's reputation, there will be consequences. There are social consequences, but there should be legal consequences as well. Happily, we've got a criminal code. We've got penal code penalties for these as well. And so our official stance is that we don't need legislation around people's behavior. What we do need is legislation around technical activities that happen online. And so that's the area that we would support OGCIO and the government of Vanuatu in terms of implementing very strong things. What you said about technical, you know, the ability of people to break into systems, there are a number of needful things in that area that I think we're all in strong agreement about. But privacy primarily is going to be handled the same way we handled privacy in the village, the same way we handle privacy in our own communities, and that is by respecting the individual and listening to the idea, you know, putting the idea above the identity of the people involved. And that means, in a lot of cases, that we actually have to willfully sort of shut our eyes to a particular thing. You know, there's a big debate happening right now on Facebook about whether a young woman should have put swear words on a protest sign. What I find fascinating is that the fact that it was a woman who put the swear words on her protest sign seems to be a bigger determination that if a man had put swear words on a protest sign for a political reason, let's say they had said, you know, or Indonesia, or, you know, the police for the, you know, or whatever. I think you know, we talk about it differently because of the identity of the people involved. That's something that you can't legislate. It has very much to do with the person's privacy, the integrity of their own identity, and they're feeling that they can participate in society, and it's something that we don't deal with enough. So if we were going to start anywhere in protecting privacy, that's where I think we should start.
Well, that's a way to start the discussion. So I'm going to get through about one before we actually wind up engaging. Of the three most important issues that are going on in my country, and I take this as countries for both Fiji and the United States. I think one is as we discussed before the break, the need for consumers who use the internet, and let's just call it the internet engagers. There is a desperate need for them to understand what is happening with their information. They need to understand it, and some of the onus of that, the burden of doing that, is in fact on the people who are going online. If you don't know what the dangers are when you go out at night in the dark, if you don't know what the dangers are when you're 3 years old and you're about to cross a busy street for the first time, you get some guidance and you get taught before you are given the authority to go and do that activity. You are licensed before you're allowed to take a 5,000-pound vehicle and move it at 30 kilometers and put it on the road. But you can, anybody who is handed a smartphone or put in front of a tablet or a computer as a one laptop per child initiative can really mess up their life without any training. And you're given the freedom to do that. And that's I find that to be unfortunate. Not that 12-year-olds shouldn't have tablets, but the 12-year-olds shouldn't have tablets until they know what they're doing with the internet. And they shouldn't have them unsupervised until they know until they're aware of what the dangers are. Much the same way they don't go walking alone for a certain age. So I think the lack of knowledge of the general populace in terms of what the risks are in various types of internet activities, and I think that's issue one. I think issue two then becomes, now that you know how the internet works, the right to choose needs to be put back in some way, shape, or form with an understandable economic model back in the hands of the individual. Right now, the debate in the United States, and to some extent the debate in the EU, is whether when you go on a Facebook page, or when you go on Google, or you go on any news site, pretty much, which is more and more reliant on advertising than on subscriptions, you give the authority automatically by going on that page for them to take the information of yours and market it. Not sell it, we talked about this before, but utilize it for advertising. Or do you have to opt in, or do you opt out? An opt-in construct says that you have to agree affirmatively. You have to click on something before they can use your information. Opt-out says they get to use your information unless you tell them you don't want them to. And the difference there is quite frankly perceived to be a major business model hurdle in the advertising world and in the free online space world. Because if you've got to agree for people to use your information, by and large people won't. As a default setting, they will say, no, you can't use it. Well, that means the information's off limits, which means that they can't use it to sell advertising to you. And that changes the business model significantly. So I think there needs to be a debate, a public debate, a very public debate in virtually every society as to whether or not an opt-in or opt-out regime is the way that society is going to move forward, and that needs to be explained to the populace in terms of what happens to their information. The third issue, and I think this doubles back on the privacy issue of the prior speaker talk about, is what do you do about what I'll call fake news, which is a major topic of conversation in the United States. It's a major topic of conversation in Great Britain because of its influence on the national debate on such things as quite frankly, the United States presidential election, and in the UK about the Brexit vote. Let me give you an example, and I don't know where Vanuatu comes out on this, and I certainly don't know where this particular group comes out. There's been a significant amount of information put on the internet by people who have, in many professionals' opinion, virtually no medical training and are unsupported by any validated scientific model in terms of a scientifically designed test. And they say that vaccinating your child is bad. The AMA, the American Medical Association, has lodged an online campaign. The CDC, Center of Disease Control, in Great Britain, National Institute of National Health Service in the U.S., National Institute of Health, WHO. Interesting, actually, WHO is kind of sitting on the sidelines. They've launched a campaign, but they can't essentially beat back this viral notion that vaccinating your child might be bad. And so what we now have in the United States is we've got outbreaks in populations that are inclined to believe what they read, because that's just the way they operate. Some of them are not well educated. Some of them are as educated as the public education system allows, but they are impoverished, so they can't read. They don't have an opportunity to read beyond what the education system has given them, and they swallow this stuff. And it is, unfortunately, considered an equal voice to the legitimate and reputationally strong press. And if everybody's voice is an equal voice, because you are dismissing reputation as what you believe and what you don't believe, then you wind up with these situations where the public health, the public safety, the public good is jeopardized. So while I'm a staunch believer in source anonymity, and I'm a staunch believer in freedom of press and freedom of speech, I kind of run on the rocks when it comes to the ability to put fake things out without retribution. And that, as far as I'm concerned, things that are everybody's entitled to their own opinion. Not everybody's entitled to their own facts. And so that I think winds up being something that societies generally are going to have to deal with, not just in the developed world, but throughout the world. I think that becomes an issue, and I haven't got an answer for that one, but I think it needs one, because I think the willingness of somebody to put something online that is outrageous to generate an audience, without regard to whether or not it is true, is an online incentive, and it is just outright dangerous to society and to the societies the small societies that we're trying to protect here. How do we train people is the next one. I think, and we talked about this earlier in terms of local language, I think there is a tremendous business opportunity to join with government and do internet training in language. While it is one thing to code in local language and bring up websites in local language and try to overcome illiteracy issues through audio sites versus visual sites and do that in local language, training people how to be safe online in local language is a business model. And teaming up with government, which I gather, although Dulcie's not here, I'm sure somebody from TRR can talk to it, about bringing up an in-language training package that is through outreach, goes out to the small villages, the remote islands, and the remote communities, and gets them trained up about what the internet's. We're probably beyond what's the internet all about. Facebook's probably out there. But what they don't know is how does the internet work and what are the internet risks? And those are things that really need to be taught in language. And so I would say there is that's a in-language application that ought to be undertaken. It is a government initiative that can be undertaken, and it cuts right to the issue of where does local language fit into an internet experience. Let's see, what was the sixth one? Are there existing policies, local or regional, that may be applicable to online privacy? I think the internet world is still sorting that out in terms of what the good practices are, what the best practices are. I think to the extent possible, and the lawyers admitted to the Vanuatu bar as what the lawyers admitted to the Fiji bar, need to decide through a legislative debate what's the right social answer, and then there needs to be a discussion about what is the right way to enforce a privacy law in the country. This needs to be an individual debate. I think there are things we talked about today in terms of we talked about earlier in terms of transactional privacy. That can be regional. That can be international. The rules of the road, if you will, the rules of the game for how an enterprise deals with its customers and how the intermediate enterprises in the online world deal with the information that they hold about people that are using their services. I think that's something that can be done on an international or regional basis, but I think at its core, a national privacy debate about how information is going to be used inside domestically, inside Vanuatu, what will be the rules for how a newspaper, if you subscribe to it, or a chat room, if you subscribe to it, or a locally driven equivalent to Snapchat or Instagram, how they are going to retain domestically the citizens' privacy. I think that's something that ought to be decided by the people of Vanuatu. And we needn't worry about the International Chamber of Commerce to decide that issue. It's exactly the point you're making, which is in the small village, it's how you treat the person in the next house. When your internet world is limited to that, and it's that issue of privacy, then I think that's a local issue. But you're not going to wind up with being able to control all of the users of Facebook who have seen a public posting with Vanuatu culture. And so that's going to wind up, unfortunately, having to be ruled upon on a different scale and legislated on a different scale. And with that, I'll close and start taking questions unless you have more questions.
Okay, thank you very much, the speakers. Now we are open to the public. If you have any questions or comments, you can direct it straight to Tema. And let's come back to the topic. The topic of this discussion is about policy guidelines with the digital era. First of all, my question to Gerard. He talks about legislation. In the legislation, we haven't seen the draft yet. We haven't been heard about when is the consultation, so we can also be part of the review. But in one of the tools of privacy, online privacy, is if we could use the ICT tools, like I've mentioned in my introduction today, to protect some of our local content, or to protect some of our local privacy here in Vanuatu. So if we could ask him this question, is it also incorporated in the legislation? And also, if is this legislation has way of some discipline, some measures to discipline anyone that has been causing the issues? Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. The cybersecurity bill, that is the one that you are mentioning. The cybersecurity legislation will be, the reason we are holding on is because we need to do the, how do I say this? The public consultation. And the public consultation, I think I had, as Dan mentioned, we had some good discussions because the bill was supposed to be discussed. It was supposed to be tabled last year, but because of this issue of public consultation, which is which is true. We need to have public say in the bill. And we have done some public consultations last year, which was done only in Malekula and Tana, but we need to do it for other provinces from north to south. And also we need to take into consideration the views of the Port Vila ICT users and the Santo, and also for the stakeholders like the newspapers, the operators, and I mean everybody that is using the internet and ICT tools. The protection of, if I understand your question correctly, you might be referencing the protection of, for example, the cultural heritage and all those stuffs in Vanuatu. The bill itself will not directly protecting this. There are some legislations that will do this and that are already available. I'm talking about the copyright laws, legislation, and all those stuffs. But the advertisement of it, yes, for sure. Before you advertise something that is that will damage the name of the country or the culture or something like this, you'll need to have some authorization from the appropriate authority in Vanuatu before you do this. And I don't think the cybersecurity legislation will do this. Actually, the government itself, we don't provide those ICT tools. Like, for example, Dan just mentioned the Signal utility that people can use to encrypt the text messages that you send to your other partner on the other side of the line. We don't normally, I don't think it's the government's role to do this because we are only the policy maker. But in terms of customer protection and consumer protection, I think it's proper to talk to our implementing agency, which is TRR, and they have a specific role in there where they look after the consumers. And it's also, I think, we can also discuss this with the operators because they deal directly with the customers. Yes, I think that is if I have answered the questions.
So my question is addressed to the government policymaker. I understand that we have in place the Vanuatu 2030, the People's Plan, and then we have the National ICT Policy that has government aspires to extend and fully implement eGov services to the people and accessible to the disability. And so we have now ongoing implementation in the immigration and all government departments to ensure that e-services is carried out to the people in the rural areas. My question is for the people to exercise their protection, the fundamental right to privacy, and in light of the recent commencement of the Right to Information Act this year in February 2017, what guarantee we have as the people in terms of our protection? Because if I may, the Act Right to Information, it states in the beginning, the objective or the proclamation part of this act. It states that this act is provided, I quote, is provided an act to provide for the guarantee of the right to information of all persons and to establish practical, effective mechanisms supportive of that right and for related matters. So I understand that the government now has there's a law in place for data and information can be collected and be used by the government. So I guess my question is, if what steps the government is now taking apart from the cybersecurity policy that we have in place, what steps the government is taking for to protect the people's information that is gathered through e-services, government services, and in light of the RTI Act. So thank you. That's my question.
Thank you for that very long question. Anyway, if I get it correctly, you want to know how do we protect people that will be accessing government services through iGov e-solutions? I think that is the question. The right to information bill, if we put it simple, says that these Vanuatu citizens, they have the right to know whatever the information they want to know. So when you say this, that means the people that are in the islands, the government needs to put in some ways for them to access all the information from Vanuatu government. In other words, how do we bring the government to the people using ICT? Anyway, this is a very challenging issue for the government at the moment. We have what we call the eGov, the GBN, the Government Broadband Network. And the purpose of implementing this tool at the beginning was to bring the government to the people using the ICT, because we have the geolocalization of Vanuatu, which is separated by seas. You have different islands spread from north out to south. And how do we make sure that people get the same information without spending money, without traveling? So the government has invested in this network. Now it is in place. We have a project that is going on now. The issue that we need to make first is to, I will be talking about technicalities. We need to secure the network first, because currently that network, we can talk to the people outside, but people cannot talk in while with security. So this is the reason why we are engaging some consultants that come in to make sure that we secure that network, so that people talk to the government within some encrypted data mechanism in order for people to be safe. So I think that word encryption is the technical word to make sure that people can be confident. So when the government implements this thing, then it will be okay for the people to talk to the government and to be sure that you are entering a private zone where you only talk to the government and no other people will be listening to or seeing or looking or copying what you're sending to the government, or the government will be sending back to you. So we are working on this. I hope by not end of this year, but maybe next year, we will have something for the people. But slowly, we have already started some framework. I know that with TRR, we are going to do something on the universal access policy. We have installed many computer labs in the islands, but how do we use those computer labs to bring back the information to the central government? And this is the challenging part. We are working on it now. Thank you. Dan, if you have some...
RTI is a topic that's very close to our hearts in the media. But yeah, there's a really important element at the core of the right to information, and that is the tension between the private individual's right to be protected and the public's right to know how government money is being spent and how our policies are being implemented, especially in regards to education and health. Let's say I do an RTI request and I want to find out about sexual abuse statistics for the last 12 months in Port Vila and Santo, and they send me a report that actually discloses the identity of some of the people involved. If I were an unscrupulous person and I found a celebrity or the wife of a public figure or somebody like this on that list, that could cause a real problem for the individuals. Or if it was just a family member, I say, oh, so so the way that the data is prepared and the way that it's handled and released is an issue that is of real concern, especially when it deals with sensitive topics. Let's say somebody is HIV positive. They don't necessarily want to tell the world that, and it really is a matter for them. The way that information gets disclosed should be entirely within that person's control. It shouldn't, the right to disclose that information shouldn't rest anywhere else. It has to do with disabilities as well, which is a real issue because some disabilities aren't obvious. And sometimes we don't want to share, you know, if I have a mental illness, I don't necessarily want to share that with the rest of the world because of the stigmatism that comes along with it. So it's a big issue. The Howard and the group that are on the RTI team, they're excellent. They're veteran people veteran journalists and media people who understand the balance, and they've got a very long. This is a 5-year implementation process. So we actually have a lot of faith in the ability of the government to implement this. The only issue that we're facing right now is there's not enough funding. We've got a team of 2 people who are full-time on the project and other people who are working in the various departments, but there's no budget line that's assigned to them, and that's a real problem because they need to travel, they need to get out to the islands to conduct the awareness and the training, and they need to do a lot of analysis of the information itself and the data sets, and there's no money for that. So we'll probably have to go to donors and say, you know, look guys, if you really want good governance to come out of this, then you need to put some money into it.
Thank you, Don.
Okay, if you could introduce yourself first and stand up. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Serena from IUCN Oceania in Fiji. My question is to Dan. Media reports on internet reach is more welcome. They get more space as compared to risk involved in getting online. And as a member of the media fraternity, has the media, Pacific Media, done enough, or are media houses doing enough to raise awareness on online privacy issues? How do you get the media to report issues on online privacy as compared to the effects of climate change? How do we make it as important as climate change?
We might argue whether they are equally important. I think climate change is a pretty big deal. I think privacy, the online privacy, is a really big deal, especially in the way it impacts our individual lives. And I agree. Implicit in the question was, have we done enough? And the answer is no, we haven't. I wrote a column, a weekly IT column in the competition, actually, in the other newspaper, starting in around 2009, and I covered a lot of these topics. I tried to explain these topics in terms that were understandable to people without any technical background. One of the examples that I used was, treat every conversation that you have in social media like a conversation that you have when the person is on the other side of the road and you're shouting back and forth. If you're not willing to shout it across the street in a public place, don't say it. That's not, social media is not the place for that. There are some simple ways that we can do that kind of education, but is enough being done? Absolutely not. And I would say that from what I've seen of Fiji media as well. I think that the lack of technological understanding is the biggest stumbling block. I could go on a long ways because I've got 20 years of tech experience and I've got the media experience. So I'm one of the very few people in the Pacific, actually, who has a little bit of expertise in both. But the fact of the matter is there's so many stories and there are so few hours in the day that it's really hard to give it the amount of attention that it deserves. We were quite vocal about the cybercrime law. We were quite critical of it, and Gerard and I still have to mend our fences with regards to that. But there's a lot more to it than that, and there's a lot that needs to be dealt with in terms of awareness raising. I don't think there's any silver bullet. I think it's just that we have to shoulder the responsibility. We have to use RTI responsibly, and all these sort of right to information aspects of it. And we have to be seen to be leaders in protecting people's privacy. Our protection of sources is unconditional, and that's something that we never ever back away from. People come at me a lot of the time, not just in public, but in private as well. I've had senior officials trying to pressure me into revealing who told me things, and I won't do it. Because if I do it, I've lost trust entirely. That actually, and just to come back to another aspect of it, which is the fake news side of things, how do we maintain our reputability in the conversation? A really interesting fact that's come out surrounding the propagation of fake news is that it tends to happen through, we tend to believe the people who are closest to us socially. And so by maintaining the distinction between public and private sources of information, and by making people understand and be able to rely on the fact that if it comes out in the Daily Post, it's true to the extent that we can verify its truth. If it comes out from my cousin so-and-so, then it's true to the extent that I trust my cousin so-and-so, which shouldn't necessarily be enough, be as much as it is from a professional. So maintaining, establishing the formal versus informal streams and making the distinction is something that the media can take part in. And part of that is not indulging in gossip, in fear-mongering, in speculative things, maintaining the Media Code of Ethics, which we do. We voluntarily support the Media Association Blow Vanuatu's Code of Ethics. At the end of the day, though, it's a parenting issue. It's something that we just need to keep doing every day, be seen to be doing, and just to show the right example.
Please stand up, introduce yourself first.
Thank you. My name is Tony from Port Vila. I have two questions to ask. Firstly, in regards to fake IDs, I think the Facebook in Vanuatu have witnessed most of the fake IDs, and they've given some very offensive comments. The question is, although these people have the right to express what they know or their opinions, the question is, do we have something in place, or the legislation that the government is preparing? Does it cover the aspect of fake IDs or not? And the second question to that is, can we trace the actual person who is creating fake IDs or not? Another question is, it should be freedom of expression face criminal proceedings. In regards to online privacy and the fake accounts, there are some comments that are offensive to others. So sometimes it is very hard for the criminal justice to address the issue because of some circumstances. Thus, we have, or the government, because earlier the Cyril was saying there are already some criminal offenses that have occurred through the banks, and these suspects are not prosecuted. In the new legislation that is put in place, do we have the victims covered in there or not? Or how can we deal with this issue? Thank you very much.
Thank you. The cyber security legislation in regards to the fake accounts. I think the cyber security legislation is there to protect the users on the cyberspace. So when the Prime Minister is summoned me 2 times, the Speaker of Parliament I think 3 times. Why they summoned me? Because they found that someone has registered an account in Facebook as the name, Charlo Salwai, or the Speaker of Parliament, and posting things to all the people as if they were the Prime Minister. But this is not the view of the Prime Minister. This is not the view of the Speaker. So this is a criminal offense. the cybersecurity legislation will not get away with the criminal legislation, the criminal act that is there already. What we do is that we will, as I already mentioned to Dan, this bill has been drafted using the existing legislations that are already there. So there will be criminal penalties that will be applied to this. And that is the reason why we are doing those public consultations, so that people know what they will be, it will happen to them if they commit those things, and also get back their views if this is fair or this is not fair on the cyberspace. The bill is there to protect the users. There will be criminal offenses. Regarding the measures on how to prevent Facebook fake accounts, there is this. I want to mention something like this, and this is the fake accounts. This is a very dangerous thing, if I can say. Of course, for the journalism, I think sometimes it's good for them because you can get news from people that don't want to get known by the public that you are the one that posted that news. But the dangerous part of it that you can build reputation on somebody based on perception, so that people will believe that this guy is doing wrong because he's like this, which is not really true. So this is very dangerous for the youth and the young generation of today, because it's very easy to sit behind a computer and posting things against somebody and using my name or your name, where in fact it's not you that is sitting behind that computer, it's somebody else. So those are the real challenges that we need to face. How do we prevent this? First thing, there are some measures, some technical measures that we can do. We can force the operators through what we call the VIX. This is something on top of my head. The legislation can force them, for example, to make sure that when you apply for you want to make a Facebook login, you put your telephone number in there, or you put your login as your telephone, something like this. And I know I've been to numerous conferences around the world, and they mention this thing. You can put your number in there so that they can track. And if you posting something wrong, then we can get back to the operators for them to find out who then the phone number is. But having said that, we have established some contacts already with Facebook, because Facebook is a privately owned web applications. And if you complain about something that is, come and see us. We can talk to the Facebook group in Sydney, and we have already done this. We blocked some Facebook accounts because they have actually sending illegal content using the net in Vanuatu. And this is wrong, and we have already started doing this. So you can come to us in OGCIU. We have a contact in Sydney that we can do this. But at the moment, since we don't have this cyber security legislation in place, then we cannot say much about this, because everything will be as a point of kickoff is there. After this, then we might think about some technical measures, but it's very difficult. I haven't found any very efficient way of doing this. It's very difficult. The best way to deal with this is, again, like Dan mentioned, is parental guidance. Emilo House, it's in the house, in the communities. We need to advocate. We need to inform our people that when you post using somebody else's account, this is wrong, and it's against our custom. I cannot be talking using somebody's identity. This is totally wrong. And when you start to understand this, then already, and please use the internet tools and social media with responsibility. This is the only thing that I can mention. Thank you.
Just to respond to the issue of libel, I've been libeled by people whose name I know, and I've been libeled by people who with fake accounts, and more times I've had malicious, very just incorrect and malicious insults sent at me by people using their own accounts. Okay, so there's no correlation between whether I'm using a fake account and whether I'm telling the truth or whether I'm being a nice person. Okay, I learned very early that the best possible response is to answer once, set the facts straight, and walk away. It's the hardest thing in the world to stop writing. But what happens is, if you get into a fight with an idiot, suddenly there are two idiots in the room. Okay. Another way that somebody put it was, never wrestle with a pig, because you'll only get covered in mud and the pig likes it. The thing is that there are ways to conduct dialogue. There will always be idiots. There will always be pigs who want to drag you into the mud, who want to make you just as filthy as they are. That's just human nature, and it's never ever going to go away, and no amount of law is going to stop. You can't legislate against people being stupid, basically. But what you can do is stop the criminal behavior. If somebody libels me, I can take them to court. If somebody pretends to be me, that's fraud. That's on the criminal, that's in the legislation now. We don't need new legislation for that. If somebody threatens my life or threatens my health or safety, there's laws against that. If somebody tries to incite one group of people against another group of people, there are laws against that. That's all criminal behavior, and it always was, whether you did it in a newspaper, on social media, or in the in the front of a crowd. So there are tools available. As Gérard has mentioned, Facebook is actually really good about handling reports. I report stuff on a regular basis, stuff that is offensive. Those photos that we see of children that are born deformed or maimed. This is horribly offensive. It's a huge imposition on their privacy, and there's no place for that kind of thing. People who are suffering, who are in grief, who are exposed in some way. That's all really, really wrong, not just on a on a legal basis, but on a moral basis. And Facebook are really, really good, actually, and they're very consistent about responding. So I think that the perception that fake accounts are the source of most of this offensive material, it's statistically speaking, if you look at it, and believe me, I get it every day, it's not true. It's actually, people will just say what is on their mind at any given moment, and sometimes they use fake accounts and sometimes they don't. Sometimes people using fake accounts say the most beautiful things. So I think we need to, to sort of take a fresh look at how that happens. And then we need to make sure that on the legislative basis that we actually do have all the bases covered, because there are still a few holes.
Yeah, I think from a legislative basis, I agree with what's just been said by Dan. The actions that are unlawful in real life are equally unlawful online. And so the outline that he just put forward of illegal behavior is true online, and that's really what winds up upsetting people. Now, there's I think there is a qualitative difference between assuming someone else's identity, which is fraud, and creating numerous false identities that aren't anybody you know, neither a public official nor your friend, but just simply creating a series of accounts so that you can haters going to hate. So you're going to wind up with just a whole bunch of trolls coming at you, thinking that it's 10 people when in fact it's the same person, or maybe it's just a bot. And right now, there's no law anywhere about that, as long as you can figure out a way to fool Facebook into letting you have that many accounts. And B, Facebook, unlike Twitter, is not really up on defeating that activity, unlike Twitter, that at least will give you an authenticated account, and you kind of move through there and they try to protect the authenticated accounts from being hacked. But I think if that latter concern is yours, which is a bunch of people who are being anonymous behind a number of accounts that are not public figures or not stealing the identity of somebody that actually exists, that's problematic. I think as a matter of economic pressure on Facebook, if the office of the OGCIO hears from the community that this kind of trolling has got to stop, and Facebook's got to start cracking down on people who have multiple accounts, which they can pretty much check if it's either coming from the same IP address or coming from the same handset. Then that's up to Facebook to start cracking down on that and start limiting the number of these posts. What we found in the United States, in terms of analysis, and I believe this goes back to March. I think they did the analysis during the U.S. election. Is that about a third of the trolling that was going on Facebook on actively political matters was bot driven. So it was mechanically, somebody had written a script that was able to create a Facebook account, and they ran it a number of times. And so with a number of identities, they were posting comments on a number of news stories, or worse, promoting a number of news stories and winding up with essentially creating an audience. So you had a fake newspaper that was presented by 12 or 1,400 fake Facebook accounts, and you'd get one goofball out there who actually existed, and he would like it, and that would then wind up propagating that fake news story into all of that guy's friends, and then all you needed was one guy in that crowd, and it would just kind of roll. But that was a common automated thing during the election. And yeah, Facebook ought to be pressured by citizens around the world to stop that kind of nonsense. And the way to do that is to get them to stop allowing these multiple accounts to be generated from the same IP address.
Hello, Cameron from Tiara. If I just add a little bit more on your comment, the guys already mentioned about Facebook and fake accounts and things like that. But one of the things, going back to it again in Vanuatu, is actually about consumer education. So we at TRR, I'd still remember last year where at the ICT day, we put our booth out there and we had lots of people come through, we had lots of school kids, and we had quite a surprising number of girls that came up to us and said, "Oh, I've got this boy hassling me online." Now sometimes it was a fake account and sometimes it wasn't. But then they asked us what we could do about it or what the government could do about it. And when you actually spoke to them, sometimes you found out that they'd added these people as friends. So someone had sent them a friend request and they accepted it, and then this person abused them. So a really simple thing is just to unfriend them. But what we would also try and speak to them about is say, well, what did they say to you? Was it a criminal act? I mean, if you think about it, if you were in a village in Vanuatu and you did something wrong, you knocked over your hedge of your neighbor, you wouldn't think to call the police in Vila and for them to fly all the way out there and to sort it. You'd probably speak to your neighbors, or you would do your local things, and that's kind of what has to happen on the internet. So Gerard can't write laws to follow around everyone on Facebook because they just don't have the time, the effort, the money to do that. But the government will get involved on the issues that are real crimes, the issues that are dangerous to life or theft or things like that. But we can all do little things to help us along. Quite a lot of people are not aware of the extent of the blocking facilities or the reporting facilities on Facebook. So now next to the post, if you're on your mobile phone, you can see a little arrow on the top right of any post on Facebook. If you click on that, you can report it, and you can tell Facebook of why you don't like it. Is it spam? Is it advertising? Is it offensive? And that's something I urge you all to do. If you're on YTS and you see someone swearing, or you see someone that is a fake account that is just trolling everyone, just do it. And then it's their responsibility to deal with it. Thank you.
But I think that goes back again to the nuts and bolts training in local language and getting that information out there. Because it does us no good to train people in terms of how to use the internet to make them internet literate, so that the ITU, gives Vanuatu a check mark for having X number of internet literate people if they don't know how to protect themselves on the internet. And if that needs to be in local language and done through a government initiative, because that's the only way it's going to wind up making sense for people to invest the time and effort to pull it all together and deliver the training, then so be it. But it ought to be part and parcel of the government's overall ICT strategy.
A really quick note, by the way, there's no swearing on the Daily Post Facebook group. There's no abuse on the Daily Post Facebook group because we don't allow it. So I think a lot of the complaints that we have about people's behavior, I think we need to look at the people who are administering the groups as much as anything else. That's something that we can control. It's something that we can influence. And quite frankly, I've been the victim of illegal, things said about me, and I just block the people and walk away. And I can't tell you how liberating it is just to never ever hear from so and so again. So it is a really useful tactic. But the fact of the matter is that it's really easy to do. I mean, we've got 3 staff who each of us, we take a little bit of time every day. It's usually 5, 10, 15 minutes. And we just go through all the comments, and if somebody swears, we delete the comment. And if they keep swearing, if they hit, past 10, 20 times, they just won't stop with the behavior, then we delete them. And that's it. And we've got, I don't know, about 20,000 people between our Facebook page and our group. It's roughly a little smaller than YTS, but the content's a lot better, and it's a much, much friendlier place.
Thank you, Andrew from TRR. I just want to add on to what I think there's one question that's being answered now about Facebook. I was going to say what Cameron just said, that the reporting part for us as users is very effective. If you report somebody on Facebook, they will definitely do something about it. I've seen that. Yes. And so as a user, you have something that you can do. Okay? So think about that. The second part is to support what Gerard has said. The government of, I'm talking for Vanuatu perspective for our international participants. Gerard, his office has a direct connection with Facebook. So if you're going out there into the community, please let people know that you can't hide with your comments. Even you are you have a fake ID, and if you commit a crime with your comment, you still will get caught. So I think this message needs to go beyond this room, if you can. And yes, so as users, because there's a lot of user level people in this room, I think it is important that we also take responsibility of how we use Facebook and how we educate people in our communities. Thank you.
Kasagalgal, Papua New Guinea. In relation to the cyber policy and legislation, I think Dan wrote extensively on that with regard to Vanuatu's cyber legislation, and I drew comparisons with Papua New Guinea's own cyber bill that was passed in Parliament. I'm not saying that the events were related, but just stating the events that took place. There was last year there was certain the government was under criticism, and on social media there was a lot of dissent. And using those platforms, demonstrations were organized, which unfortunately led to student shootings. And after the very next Parliament sitting, a cyber policy bill was passed and drew concerns on censorship. So just a quick question is that are there any considerations on government censorship with the upcoming legislation in Vanuatu, and if might provide some insight on other small islands that are looking to pass their own cyber legislation? Thank you.
Censorship. I think I will give this question to be answered by my ICT guy who is sitting there, the ICT policy. He is the one that has worked a lot with the, cybersecurity legislation. But before he answers the question, I would like to mention that I've been approached by the Chinese guy, the Chinese ambassador. He told me that, you know, us in China, we ban Facebook because Facebook is source of social unrest. That can be true, as you mentioned, PNG. But we have also that public responsibility and the freedom of speech and media, which is written in the Constitution. So we have to balance, we have to have some balance legislation in here, but I'm not sure if this censorship issue is being addressed in this legislation. It can be, if it's not, but we need to have this. I think the best way to deal with it will be what we do the consultation and people to talk, people to give their views. Jackson, what do you think about this?
Thank you, and good afternoon to us all. My name has been read out, Jackson from OGCIO. In regards to the cybercrime bill, I think Dan has covered it extensively in his article on Daily Post late last year. And in the current cybercrime bill for Vanuatu, there's nothing on censorship. It doesn't cover censorship in detail. However, our bill is aligned with our current existing legislations in terms of penal code and other bills under law. However, I'll just go through what's been covered. In the bill, it covers things like illegal access, illegal remaining, interception, illegal interception, data interference, espionage, system interference, illegal devices, things related to computer-related forgery, fraud, computer-related fraud, child pornography, pornography itself, identity-related crimes, spam, cyber stalking, solicitation of children, defamation, and aiding and abetting. So generally, we do not want to isolate this bill to what other laws that are already existing. We would like to align this bill with what's already around, like the penal code and other laws, so that they are uniform in all the offenses, how investigations are carried out, etc. So, yeah, in summary, nothing on censorship. Thanks.
Issue obviously is a very sensitive one for the media because we're the first. We're usually in the first line when censorship comes into play. There's nothing explicitly about censorship in the cybercrime legislation, and the Vanuatu government has, in recent years, certainly the current administration has shown a real commitment to increased openness rather than, they really are participating in an open dialogue, and they're quite respectful. I have been sort of chastised and browbeaten by political leaders in the past about, with language that was very close to censorship, but that hasn't happened much in the recent past. There are a couple of items of concern in the legislation itself. One is the definition of defamation. It's different from the one that's in the penal code. It conceivably could create a liability. I don't think it's a deliberate decision. I don't think that somebody's sort of twisting, sort of tightening the screws using subterfuge or anything like that. I really do think that it's just a discrepancy in the drafting process. There's one element of language in the way in which investigators are appointed, like somebody who's basically given the authority to conduct a surveillance operation or to seek records and whatnot. The language in there is I think a little bit too vague, and needs to be tightened up. But these are technical things. I think in its heart of hearts, you know, if the government could be said to have a heart, and I think it can, I think that the government of Vanuatu has always been a good participant in the public dialogue, and they've always appreciated that, you know, the right to criticize should be protected. It varies, you know, because tempers flare sometimes and you get personalities coming into it, but by and large that's been okay. And I trust that with a little more work, the cybercrime legislation can be put together in such a way that we don't inadvertently give any levers, any additional levers to government to crack down on political speech. But honestly, it's not that's not really a big concern for me. I see the liabilities, and I think they need to be dealt with. But I'm really confident that we can actually deal with them.
Is the office talking about unifying the frameworks? Has the office looked into this framework, unifying the regional frameworks, and if so, can you briefly tell us about it? Thank you.
PIRRC was formed out of an idea of the ministers of telecommunications or information that met in Tonga, I believe, in 2014. The idea was to create a center of excellence because the ministers of those islands understood that they were just short resources, and that pooled the island nations could come up with a central repository of data that they could look to compare how each of the islands were doing, sort of a best practices to compare not just how they were doing versus each other, but also against the rest of the developed and developing world in Asia and beyond, as well as get some technical expertise to do some training and be at the cutting edge along with the rest of the world on telecommunications technical development. So things like spectrum management, things like that. It is modeled to some extent on a group of 5 nations in the Caribbean, which recognized the same problem about 10 years before it was identified here. It took about 4 of those 10 years for the 5 nations to agree on a treaty whereby they agreed to each of them give up a piece of their sovereignty, in effect, and allow this regional regulator to set a certain prescribed set of rules in a certain set of areas for telecommunications. So ECTEL, as it's now known, Eastern Caribbean Telecommunications Authority, sets the rules for inter-exchange rates, something that TRR typically would do, and the ground rules for licensing, and the ground rules for spectrum management, who can have spectrum in what area, as well as the spectrum auctions for the region. Now that required getting all the way up to having five governments agree by treaty to do that. And it was a long process. It works fairly well. They have not tried moving into a policy as opposed to kind of a technical kind of framework. What PIRRC would like to see is, and what we're currently acting as a function is, to create policy templates for the regional governments. We can't be binding. We're just a group of consultants and downstream consultancies. Nor did the ministers particularly give us the mandate to be binding, but we can recommend, and we can explain, and we try to explain why we're recommending what we're recommending, as opposed to just throwing a piece of legislation over the transom. And then it's up to the regulators, who are our clients, and the ministries, who are our clients, where there are no regulators, to move those ideas forward. I personally believe the Pacific is ripe for having some regulation by treaty and each nation giving up a piece of its sovereignty, so that there would be a a centralized resource to do certain types of activities, among them licensing and among them spectrum monitoring, things that have objective standards. But I think the cultures are different enough, and the desire to remain entirely sovereign is strong enough that each nation is going to want to maintain its own rights to policy making on such things as privacy, on such things as what's libel, on such things as how and to what extent you can criticize the government. In Fiji, we have issues with sedition laws, which I think are going to have to be decided nation by nation, as opposed to being done on an international basis. But from a technical perspective, on things that are that are measurable, objectively measurable, I think the Pacific can have a regional regulator on those kinds of issues. We are advocating it. We can only push it so far. Our mandate is only for 3 years, and we hope that the concept of a regional center of excellence is adopted by the ministers to go forward after that. But they would have to fund it, and that's a major issue. There's no question that the money that ADB and World Bank have provided to for us to move forward would be a strain on the governments if they tried to self-fund it, and would even be a strain if the telecommunications operators were asked to chip in to fund it, because they would just end up with increased prices on your telecom. So it really comes down to an issue as to whether the governments in the Pacific see what we do as worth enough, and what they would be relieved of, to some extent, as worth enough for them to move the idea of a regional regulator, of any types of regional regulation forward. I think we can be a model for what they're going to have to do with the oceans. They're going to have to regulate the sea in the name of climate change, and in the name of those communities that rely on fishing in the sea for their livelihood. So I think we'd be a good starting point in terms of the field of telecommunications, but obviously they're only going to be able to do it so far in terms of the money they've got to do it with.
Okay, I think that's our last comment, and we think we appreciate the speakers. They had fed us with a lot of information about the policy and framework, legal framework of online privacy. Thank you so much, OGCIO. Thank you so much, Mark and Dan. After this, I'll give back the mic to Andrew so he can introduce the afternoon session. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. It was a very rich discussion. Could we please give a round of applause to our panelists for this afternoon? So we're going to break for coffee, and the next session will be a breakout session. Please do stick around because that will be a chance for us to speak up more. So we're going to break up into small groups, and then it's going to give us a chance to express our views more on what has been the discussion so far, and the issues that we would like to address, and the concerns, our own privacy concerns, and what we would like for government and for the private sector to do. And of course, all of this will be summarized, and we'll be passing it on to regional bodies and of course the TR and OGCO as well. So yeah, so please do stick around, and it's only another hour and a half, I think.